Break.
Hey there, and welcome again to this episode of videos, or this episode in the series of videos that I've been doing on human sexuality. This is for you, Sunny Slope. As you know, our denomination is facing this issue in a very pivotal way. In about a month, so about a month from now, our synod will be meeting and they'll be discussing these recommendations on our position as a denomination on human sexuality. And so these videos have been made to orient you to the proposals that are being made, but also to give you some insight into what does the Bible teach about human sexuality. And in my last video, we looked at the question. We looked at the issue of the design, what is sex designed for, and we did that because I suggested to you then that if we really want to understand why something is sinful, then we have to understand what it's designed for. In other words, you can't understand distortion until you understand design, because sin does not just exist as a. I mean, this is a little philosophical, but I think it's worth considering. Sin, when we think of it, it does not exist by itself. It's not an individual, isolated entity. It is actually something that that takes something good and it distorts it, and it uses it and changes its purpose. And this is true for human sexuality. When we think about what the Bible says about sexual sins, and this is all sexual sins, if we want to understand why something is not good, it's good for us to look at God's design in sexuality. So we did that in our last video, and I made the case that human sexuality there's at least three purposes. The first is that it's a way that human beings, two people, male and female, come together in a way that reflects the covenant relationship of God and reflects the image of God in a way that allows two people to become incredibly vulnerable and intimate and knowing one another in the most deeply personal way. And then the second way is that the biblical perspective on human sexuality is that it's actually meant for erotic enjoyment. And so I pointed you to the Song of Songs, which is actually one of the most vivid descriptions of human sexuality. It's love poetry, and it's explicit enough that it would make even the most prudish person tend to blush. And so and the point in that is, of course, is that the Bible is very sex positive. It's not negative. It's not prudish at all, but it elevates the position and the enjoyment of human sexuality. And then the third thing that we talked about in the last video was that sex is really meant to reflect the image of God, or I should say the nature of God. And so when two become one, there's a sense in which in this vulnerable, intimate relationship, there's something of the divine nature seen in that, and it reflects the way that God relates to his people. There's something about the way that God forms a covenant, and out of this in the nature of God, out of this relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there's this creative power that takes place, and that's meant to point to the power of sexual intimacy. The joy of knowing and being known actually has the power then to create life, and to at least make us co-creators in life. And so there's all these kind of facets to human sexuality, and it's all meant to all of these are sort of the biblical perspectives on human sexuality. Now we're going into my study today, and I'm taking you here because I want to look at some of the passages that talk about sexual sin. And I want to make it clear from the very beginning, and this is actually more important than it might sound. We are only focusing on one facet of sexual sin, and there are, of course, others. There's not one simple sexual sin, but there are lots of things the Bible has to say about human sexuality. The Bible actually creates boundaries around sexuality, and it does that for a purpose, of course. And it would actually be beneficial to look at a lot of those sins, and in order to understand why they are a distortion. But for sake of time, and just to stay on focus and with respect to what's happening denominationally, we're really only going to look at today anyways about homosexuality. And we're going to ask the question, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? And to do that, I want to take you to a couple of kind of the main passages in the Bible, a couple of really one Old Testament section, and then about 3 New Testament sections. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through these, and just, I'm not going to say everything there is to say about these, but I'm going to make a couple of observations, and hopefully this kind of helps you at least understand the biblical case for homosexuality. The first is this: Leviticus 18 verse 22, and then 20 verse 13. In these passages, it's the verse where it says, "Do not lie with a man as one does with a woman, for that is an abomination." And then again in chapter 20 verse 13, it repeats that, and actually it goes so far as to prescribe the death penalty for this, which is a very sobering statement. And actually I'll get into the penalty, make a comment on the penalty of it actually in a later video. Raises issues, but we're gonna we'll talk about that later. Leviticus 18 verse 22, Leviticus 20 verse 13. One of the things that's important in a verse like this, or in a section in a chapter like this, is the context. Leviticus is a book that deals with the question: how do sinful and fallen people live in the presence of a holy God in their midst? And so the Israelites have God dwelling among them right in the center of their camp. And so how do if you have this holy, pure, righteous, perfect God, a God that is so overwhelmingly perfect and pure that any kind of imperfection or sin is not only is it not welcome, but it simply cannot be in the presence of holiness. Holiness would consume it. And so you've got a massive problem. How do these fallen and sinful people live in the presence of this holy God? And the message of the whole book of Leviticus is that purification is needed, and you need to find a way to atone, and you need to find a way to cleanse things. And what you realize is that everything is affected by the presence of God. There is nothing in your life that is off limits from the presence of God. Every action comes under the umbrella of God's character and his nature. And so you've got this question then: how does that play out in terms of human relationships? And the calling then for the people is to be holy, to live holy and consecrated lives that are free morally, ceremonially, ritually from any kind of imperfection and any kind of impurity. And so the book of Leviticus then, in fact, all of chapter 18 and chapter 20 talk about relationships, and specifically, what are the boundaries on sexual relationships? In other words, how does the holiness of God affect sexual relationships? How does relationship with God, if you live in relationship with God, how does that affect your relation? How does that affect your sex life, essentially? And there are a whole list of prescriptions there, and a whole list of descriptions on what you may not do. And it includes everything from bestiality to incest to adultery. All of these things are defined as being off limits because they violate that law of purity. They violate the laws of what is right. Now, some people have said, well, the passage in Leviticus is really not describing homosexuality. It's not really so concerned about two people of the same sex having sexual relations. It's really describing a power imbalance. It's really trying to make the case that God is really more concerned about a person using their position, their physical strength to subdue another person. In other words, it's really talking about rape or coercion of some kind, or it's a master-slave sort of thing. The problem with that understanding is that the penalty that is prescribed, which is in chapter 20, so chapter 18 lists all the sexual sins, chapter 20 then lists the penalties. The problem is that the penalty for sexual sin applies to both partners in the sexual relationship. In other words, if there's a relationship between two people of the same sex, then the penalty, it's not that the person abusing their position of power is penalized and the other person is not. They're both given the penalty. And so Leviticus 18 cannot really, it's not likely, it's not really possible to assume that, or to conclude that these passages in Leviticus are talking about a power imbalance. What it's really doing is it's saying that um, again, consistent with the book of Leviticus, God has this picture of purity and perfection, and any kind of sexual activity that violates the created order, that violates the order that God has designed, is a violation of God's will when it comes to sexuality. And so that's why for example, like you've got, there are these prohibitions against planting different kinds of seeds in different kinds of fields. You can't mix those two. You can't mix cotton and linen. So you're supposed to, and the idea there is purity. The idea is keeping something uniform. And so it seems that Leviticus is saying you've got to stay consistent with your created order. That seems to be what the message is. Now, people raise objections to this, which actually enough that we're going to devote a separate video to it. One of the questions is, well, what about, there are prohibitions in Leviticus against eating shellfish, for example. And we don't follow those. Most people, almost nobody would try to maintain a diet free from shellfish unless you're Orthodox Jew. And that's a good point, and that's a fair question. But what you have to recognize is that in the New Testament, when you move from the Old Testament into the New Testament, the prohibitions against bestiality and incest and adultery are reaffirmed in the New Testament, while many of the dietary laws are not. Now, we're going to get into that more in a different video, a little more detail, but just understand that that's one of the objections, and how to answer that. Romans chapter 1. Hang on, something. All right, sorry about that. I think we fixed it. The next passage that I want to look at is from Romans chapter 1, and I'm going to put this up on the screen here for just a moment so you can read it. Romans chapter 1, we're beginning in verse 26, where it says, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." This is, again, you can see from Romans chapter 1. Now, the question in this text and the issue revolves around what is meant by natural relations. That is a critical question, because natural could be just your own desire, like what is it that you desire? And if your natural relation is for someone of the same sex, then is it possible then that Paul is not opposed to that, but he's actually just opposed to you acting against your natural impulses? I'm putting one of the things that you can do, of course, when you come to a passage like this in the Bible, you go to, you identify the words that seem to be critical, and then you dig in, you do a study on the words, you look at dictionaries and try to understand in what other contexts were these words used, what did they mean, what do they refer to? And when we do that with this word natural, we find out that it's a word physikos. My Greek pronunciation isn't always very good. You hear in that the word physical, right? So physics, physikos, and that's, the physical world is the natural world. It's the created world. And one of the things that you begin to see when you do a definition, when you study the definition of this, you look at its usage in other sources. It's not very commonly used in the New Testament, by the way. I'll put it back up on the screen for just a moment. You can see that when you kind of study the word, you see that there's 3 times that it's used in the New Testament, and 2 of them are right here in Romans chapter 1. The third time is in 1 Peter, where it talks about creatures of instinct, is the word, so natural creatures. The meaning of this word begins to become clear. It has to do with the natural desire, the natural design or purpose of something. What was it created for? And so then when you take a step back and you look at the larger context, you actually see that Paul is making all kinds of references to the Genesis 1 account of creation. He's talking about birds and reptiles and other creatures. He's talking about the man and the woman, which seems to be a reference to Adam and Eve, and he's talking about natural things. And so Paul's argument seems to be quoting, or at least certainly alluding to, the way that God created human beings in Genesis chapter 1. And how did he do that? Well, we know male and female, he created them. And then we read that God brings them together. A man shall leave his mother and father, and the two shall become one flesh. So when Paul uses the language of natural, when he uses the language of natural relations, he seems to be suggesting the creational understanding of man and woman as being made for one another, for sexual intimacy. That's a contextual argument there, but again, Paul seems to be making the case quite strongly that when we violate the created order, the way that God intended Adam and Eve, human beings, which we see in Adam and Eve, that is a violation of God's intention. Let's go to another passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verses, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 9 and 10. I'll put this back up on the screen again. And here, do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters or adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, the greedy, drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. So you can see there's the text from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The question is, what does it mean? I'm going to take you to, actually, let's do this. Let me do one more time here. Let me take you to another verse where the same word is used, and that's 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. The law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I've been entrusted. There are a couple of words that are used in both of these passages that help us, I think, gain some understanding. One of the words is another Greek word. It's malakos, and it's only used a couple of times. It's only used, I think, 4 times in the New Testament. Three of those times actually refer to sort of fine clothing, which is kind of a strange reference. But the meaning there, it suggests that there was this was sort of a euphemism for effeminate. So a person who is malakos was a reference to effeminate as a way of talking about a person, and it sort of became that a way of referring to a person who was in a homosexual relationship. So euphemistically, the effeminate person in a same-sex relationship would be the person who was assuming the female role in homosexual activity. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, that word, malakos, is paired with a different word, which is arsenkotai, which, I'll actually put that back up on the screen here. Well, I'll skip that, that's all right. Arsenkotai is the word that was often used to refer to the person assuming the male role in a same-sex relationship. And so that's the word that's translated as men who have sex with other men. And so you get this picture of two people violating the created sexual order. Sexually immoral men who practice homosexuality, and sexually immoral people. So here's the point. What Paul is doing here is a couple things. First of all, he's speaking of as off limits as behavior as those who engage in same-sex relationships, men who have sex with men, to be very crude about it, those who take the dominant position and those who take the passive position. That seems to be what he's suggesting. So he's speaking against same-sex relationships. The other thing that he's doing, that word arsenkotai, is a word that it's not found in any other place, in not only in the Bible, but in much of other ancient literature. It seems that what Paul is doing there is he's actually borrowing a word that from the book of, he's actually not borrowing a word, he's actually inventing a word by borrowing the language of Leviticus chapter 18, because what he's doing is he's putting together two words, arsen and kotai, which are, when you put them together, you get arsen kotai, which is, arsen means male and kotai means to go to bed with. And so and that's when you look at the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that's the language that is used in Leviticus chapter 18, where you read about, you shall not have sexual relations with a man as you do with a woman. The word there is translated arsenkotai. And so what Paul is doing is he's actually quoting Leviticus here in the New Testament, and he's actually creating this. He's creating this word, and what in doing that, he's actually affirming the message of the Old Testament. He's actually affirming, hey, what Leviticus said, we are still called to that. We are still called to that kind of holiness in the way that we live, and therefore we are not to have sexual relationships with people of the same sex. We're not to engage in sexual relationships with one another in terms of being in terms of practicing same-sex activity. And so he's kind of showing that continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So here's the point in all of this. The message of the New Testament is really reaffirming the message of the Old Testament. It's that when God calls us people into relationship with himself, when he calls us into a relationship with a holy God, he's actually calling us into a way of obedience that is patterned on the created order, the natural order. And so he's calling us then to reject sexual activity that would be in violation of his word. And he's calling us to recognize that same-sex activity is not a part of the created order. It's not part of the natural way that God created things, and he's calling us out of that. And it's a message that's spoken both in the Old Testament, and then it's reaffirmed in the New Testament. Now, I realize that there are a lot of objections that people have. There are a lot of things that people will say, wait a minute, you haven't addressed this, or what about that? And these are good questions and they're good objections. And we're actually going to address those, but it's going to take a separate video to do that. So I hope you'll join me next time. We will pick it up then. Until then, would you do me a favor, like our channel and subscribe, get new videos, leave some comments, share these videos around, and please feel free to comment as well. Thanks for watching. See you next time.